Today, Russian President Vladimir Putin is apologizing for what he calls a tragic incident.
Vladimir Putin's 25-year absolute rule was shattered in a single week. In just days, the Kremlin's most fundamental doctrines were trampled underfoot. Now, before our very eyes, an empire is collapsing. Russia, once a feared energy giant, is now begging China for fuel. Once the commander of a superpower army, it now imports soldiers from Cuba and Colombia to fill its ranks. Its most trusted Arab allies have abandoned it. Worst of all, Putin himself was forced to formally apologize to a small neighbor in front of cameras. Vladimir Putin had to call the leader of Azerbaijan, once seen as Russia's backyard where he could do whatever he wanted, and officially apologize in front of the whole world. This moment may go down in history as a footnote, but make no mistake, this is only the smallest and most symbolic part of the iceberg that is visible. This is not the story of a single bad day, an unfortunate phone call. This is the death knell of the fairy tale of Russia as a great power. These four events, when taken together, are not a fiasco, but proof of a systemic bankruptcy. These four chain collapse links tell the story of how Russia's military, economic, diplomatic, and personal power evaporated. So how did this regime, which proclaimed its invincibility for years, prepare such a humiliating end in such a short time? To understand how this total destruction came about, we must scrutinize each of these chain collapse links with the meticulousness of an expert examining open-source data. The details of how Putin created this chaos with his own hands lie before us like a shameful intelligence report. The roots of this systemic decay lie in chronic corruption and accountability that has been accumulating for over 20 years. Collapse always begins with the betrayal of the most loyal friends. The first horseman of the apocalypse is diplomatic death. Have you heard what happened to the Russia-Arab World Summit, which Putin announced months ago with great fanfare as proof of Russia's global power? Probably not, because the summit turned into one of the Kremlin's biggest diplomatic defeats in history and was quietly cancelled in shame. Even the Moscow Times, known for its anti-Western reporting, couldn't hide this fiasco. According to the newspaper's sources in the Kremlin, only a handful of the 22 Arab leaders invited bothered to come to Moscow. Even more painful was that countries such as Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and the United Arab Emirates, which Russia sees as its key allies in the Middle East, refused to even grant Putin an appointment. This was not a postponement. It was a heavy steel door slammed in Putin's face. Putin, who once saved the regime in Syria, called the shots in Libya, and hosted African leaders in his palace, had now become an unwanted man in the Middle East and the global South, having completely lost his credibility. Power vacuums are not tolerated, and every ounce of prestige Putin lost in the Ukrainian quagmire was instantly filled by other actors. Putin's diplomatic collapse was not limited to distant lands. The most painful link in the chain of isolation occurred on Russia's own doorstep, in the lands once defined as Russia's backyard. According to the latest report published by the respected think tank German Marshall Fund, the Russian army's incompetence in Ukraine created a huge strategic vacuum in the South Caucasus. Countries such as Armenia and Azerbaijan, which for years took orders from Moscow and depended on the Kremlin's arbitration, no longer see Russia as a hegemon or protective power. On the contrary, they see it as weak, unreliable, preoccupied with its own problems, a paper tiger. This erosion of power has been made concrete by the transformation of Moscow's peacekeeping forces in the region into ineffective observers. Neither Baku nor Yerevan now knock on the Kremlin's door to resolve their problems. Putin has become an isolated leader who cannot control even his neighbors, let alone his global allies, and who cannot even enforce his will within his own sphere of influence. The evaporation of diplomatic power inevitably goes hand in hand with military and economic collapse. Once marketed in propaganda films as the world's second army, the Russian military machine is now forced to beg for soldiers from Cuba, a country struggling with poverty and sanctions, because it cannot find soldiers to send to the front. According to a scandal uncovered by Spain's respected newspaper El País, and soon confirmed by Ukrainian military intelligence documents, Russia is luring approximately 20,000 young Cubans to the slaughter in Ukraine with false promises of high salaries and Russian citizenship. Analyses in Small Wars Journal clearly show that this process is based on fraud. These people, fleeing poverty, are being lured to the front lines with promises of high salaries and Russian citizenship. which is indicative of chaos and systemic corruption. The moral and logistical rotting within the Russian army has become visible. However, this is not a simple mercenary agreement. It is an admission that a superpower has failed militarily and demographically, has exhausted its own human resources, and is resorting to the most desperate methods to fill the gaps on the front lines. It also demonstrates how collapsed the mobilization system is. The fact that an army of millions is trying to cover frontline losses with such shameful methods shows that Putin's military power has been wiped out. The reality that the Kremlin is now trying to hide its battlefield losses by begging outside its own borders exposes the regime's weakness. This military fiasco is also an admission that Russia has put itself in an indefensible position. If a state cannot convince its own citizens to go to war and is forced to send the youth of a poor island to their deaths on the front lines, that state is militarily finished. This is not a strategic move, but strategic desperation. And this military bankruptcy is followed by the third and most ironic horseman of the apocalypse, economic collapse. Here is one of the greatest tragedies of modern history. Russia, which for years threatened Europe by threatening to shut off its natural gas and oil valves, using energy as a weapon, is now begging Asia because it cannot find gasoline for its own army and people. According to a report by the Kyiv Independent, based on satellite imagery and commercial data analysis, Ukraine's relentless kamikaze drone attacks over the past 6 months have destroyed approximately 40% of Russia's oil refining capacity. This is a technical breaking point. Ukraine's cheap technology has destroyed Russia's massive and cumbersome energy infrastructure. The result is complete chaos. This situation has started a cycle of Russia sabotaging itself. The economic collapse manifested itself in miles-long lines at gas stations and created civilian panic among farmers left helpless in their fields. Export bans, panic buying, and rising prices turned this crisis into a management disaster. Russia's economic backbone has been halted by Ukraine's smart innovations. While tanks on the front lines couldn't refuel, kilometer-long queues formed at gas stations within Russia itself. And what did the Kremlin do as a solution? Secretly, trying to hide its shame, it signed emergency agreements to import 150,000 tons of gasoline per month from countries like China and Singapore. The devastation of giant refineries in Ryazan, St. Petersburg, Smolensk, Kazan, and Volgograd forced Russia to make plans to import 150,000 tons of gasoline per month. This is a shameful helplessness for an industrial country. The former energy bully has now become a fuel importer. This is the most concrete, undeniable picture of economic collapse. The issue is no longer just the value of the ruble. The issue is that the lifeblood feeding the war machine, namely oil, has been drained from its veins. A country that once threatened all of Europe with energy is now forced to import gasoline from China, South Korea, and Singapore to fuel its own people's cars. So Russia's oil empire has blasted itself. Diplomatic betrayal, military bankruptcy, and economic collapse. These three horsemen paved the way for the fourth and most deadly, personal humiliation. And we return to the moment when it all began, when all these symptoms of collapse crystallized in a single instant: Vladimir Putin's apology. According to a report by Anadolu Agency and Caucasian media, based directly on a Kremlin press release, Putin formally apologized by phone to his counterpart Ilham Aliyev for the Azerbaijani plane mistakenly shot down by Russian peacekeepers. This is not a routine diplomatic gesture in international relations. This is the image of the strong leader who never backs down, never admits mistakes, never apologizes, which Putin has carefully built up over a quarter of a century, being shattered by his own words. Putin's entire political career was built on the promise of repairing the sense of national humiliation caused by the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was the leader who brought Russia back to the table and refused to bow to the West. But in that phone call, it was he himself who bowed. The fear that Russia's traditional hegemon role could now be filled by Turkey, Iran, and even the West exposed the reality that Moscow cannot even control its own regional security. This is not just a diplomatic failure, it is a complete reshaping of regional geopolitics. Russia is no longer a reliable partner for all the countries around it, but has become nothing more than an obstacle. The former Soviet satellite states are taking advantage of this opportunity to break free from Moscow's shadow. This moment of apology is shocking even when taken on its own, but when combined with the other three horsemen, it reveals the true scale of the destruction. Arab leaders abandoning him like a leper, begging Cuba for soldiers, asking China for fuel. The cancellation of the Arab summit has devastated the Kremlin's efforts to maintain its power in the Middle East despite the war in Ukraine. This is concrete evidence of a loss of international prestige. It revealed how fragile Russia's alternative economic support network, built in response to Western sanctions, really is. If key Arab players such as Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Egypt are distancing themselves from Russia, it means that the Kremlin is now seen not as a long-term partner, but as a sinking ship. These countries saw that Russia's resources were depleted and that it could no longer offer them stability. As Moscow's resources dwindle, its allies are not hesitating to turn their backs on it. This shows how power diplomacy has been wiped out on paper. All these events are different parts of a profound display of weakness and helplessness that peaked at that moment of apology. Putin is now a leader who can no longer control either his friends or his enemies, whose charisma and deterrence are completely gone. As noted by respected think tanks such as the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the image of Putin as a macho, judo-practicing, stallion-riding leader, which he has polished for years with his propaganda machine, is now nothing more than an outdated hollow joke that does not correspond to the painful reality on the ground. Power is perception, and Putin's perception of invincibility has been destroyed forever with that phone call. This personal humiliation is not only the death of a leader, but also of the great power Russia doctrine he represents. So why did it all happen at once? Were these 4 events independent crises? Absolutely not. These 4 events are 4 different symptoms of the same cancer. And the name of that cancer is Putin's doctrine, known as the restoration of great power, which is detached from reality and fed by arrogance. This is systemic decay. The equation is simple. Without military power, while suffering defeat in Ukraine, you have no diplomatic influence, no weight to your words. Your allies abandon you. Without economic power, with your industry collapsing under sanctions, you cannot sustain that military power. You cannot send soldiers or fuel to the front. And under the weight of all these failures, when a leader's personal charisma, that aura of invincibility, collapses, the whole structure comes crashing down like a cardboard house in the slightest breeze. The military failure in Ukraine triggered economic collapse. The combination of these two systematically destroyed Russia's appeal and prestige in the international arena. And the total weight of all these failures ultimately crushed Putin's personal image and charisma. This is an unstoppable domino effect, and the last tile is about to fall. The situation facing Russia and Putin is no longer a problem that can be overcome with simple crisis management or a change in strategy. As analyses published on academic platforms such as ResearchGate and written by international relations experts also emphasize, what Russia is experiencing is much deeper than a strategic failure. This is not a temporary ailment that can be cured. It is a terminal, i.e., fatal disease, rooted in the heart of the system, its DNA, fueled by systemic failure and endemic corruption. Corruption, incompetence, and detachment from reality, which have been eating away at the army, the state, and society for years, have become impossible to hide under the stress of the Ukraine war and have brought the entire system to the point of collapse. A system where tanks claimed to be modernized are merely painted, missiles said to be produced do not actually exist, and soldiers said to be trained are sent to the front unprepared cannot possibly survive a real war. And now that impossibility is becoming reality. There is no easy way back from this strategic stalemate. History has shown us that when the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse appear at the same time, it is a harbinger of disaster. For Russia, the path of return is now almost completely closed. A state that has been completely isolated, abandoned even by its closest diplomatic allies, whose army has become exhausted and unable to meet its most basic needs, whose economy has collapsed under the weight of war, and whose leader has lost all his charisma and become afraid of his own shadow, has no chance of surviving as a great power in the modern world. Putin's options are no longer to win or lose. His options are limited to how quickly and how bloodily he will collapse. With each passing day, every Russian tank burning on Ukrainian soil is another nail in the Kremlin's coffin. This collapse is no longer just a theory of military analysts, but a concrete reality confirmed by data from the field, international reports, and most importantly, the Kremlin's own actions. As you can see, these 4 events crammed into the last few days are not the beginning of the end, but the end itself, announcing the death of an empire to the world. Diplomatic death, military bankruptcy, economic collapse, and personal humiliation. The 4 horsemen of the apocalypse are no longer just a theoretical concept. They are a concrete reality knocking on Moscow's doors, galloping through the Kremlin's corridors. Vladimir Putin's quarter-century empire, built on fear and oil money, is evaporating before our eyes like a fast-forwarded film. From this point on, what we will do is no longer an analysis, but an autopsy, and we at PPR Global will be here to document every moment, every detail of this historic collapse and explain to you what the bigger picture means. The throne is empty, the walls of the Kremlin are shaking, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse are impatient to complete their mission. Thank you for choosing us.